I was standing in my kitchen, pouring my third cup of coffee when I heard the screech of tires, the crunch of metal against wood, and then silence that made my stomach drop. Through my kitchen window, I could see the snowstorm had transformed my property in northern Michigan into a white wasteland, and somewhere through that wall of white, something had just gone very wrong. I grabbed my coat and boots, jamming my feet in as I stumbled toward the door. The February wind hit me like a frozen hammer when I stepped outside. My private road, which I'd specifically chosen this property for, wound through 3 acres of pine trees before connecting to the main subdivision road. I could barely see 10 feet ahead through the driving snow, but I knew exactly where that sound had come from. When I finally made it around the bend, I found Brenda Patterson's silver Lexus embedded in what used to be my split-rail fence. The front end had taken out at least 15 feet of it, and wooden posts stuck up at odd angles like broken teeth. Brenda herself sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, her perfectly styled blonde hair barely disturbed despite the chaos. "Are you okay?" I shouted over the wind, approaching the driver's side door. She rolled down the window about 2 inches, just enough for her voice to carry. "Isaac Anderson, this is completely unacceptable. Your road is a sheet of ice. I could have been killed." I stood there in the blowing snow, trying to process what I was hearing. "Brenda, are you hurt? Do you need me to call an ambulance? I need you to explain why you haven't maintained this road properly. I had every reason to believe it would be safe for travel." My jaw must have been hanging open. "This is my private driveway. You don't even live down here. What are you doing on my property?" She gave me that look, the one I'd seen her use at HOA meetings when someone suggested something she didn't approve of. Brenda was the president of the Pinewood Heights Homeowners Association, a position she'd held for 6 years and wielded like a scepter. I was conducting HOA business, making sure all properties were being properly maintained during the storm. Several residents expressed concern about snow removal compliance. During a blizzard, and on my private road that isn't part of the HOA jurisdiction. That remains to be seen. Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there arguing while I freeze? I bit back at least 5 responses that would have made the situation worse, and instead focused on getting her out safely. Her Lexus was still running, the wheels spinning uselessly against the ice and snow. I helped her out of the vehicle, noting that she didn't seem injured, just angry. That was Brenda's default state, as far as I could tell. "I'll call a tow truck," I said, pulling out my phone. "You'll do more than that. I'll be sending you a bill for repairs to my vehicle, and I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA board." "The HOA has no authority over my private driveway, Brenda. We've been through this before." That was true. When I'd purchased the property 2 years ago, Brenda had tried to argue that my private road connecting to the subdivision meant it fell under HOA rules. My lawyer had shut that down with a single letter citing the property deed and Michigan state law. The road was mine, maintained by me and used only by me. We'll see what the board says about that, and what my lawyer says. I should have known then that this was going to become a bigger problem than a wrecked fence. The tow truck took 90 minutes to arrive, and by then the storm had intensified to near whiteout conditions. Brenda waited in my house, sitting ramrod straight on my couch and refusing every offer of coffee or tea. She spent the entire time on her phone, typing furiously with her thumbs. I had no doubt she was already spinning this story to the other board members. When the tow truck finally extracted her Lexus, the damage was significant. The front bumper was crumpled, one headlight was shattered, and the hood had a substantial dent. My fence had done a number on her car, though my fence had definitely gotten the worse end of the deal. "I'll be in touch," Brenda said as she climbed into the tow truck's cab, not even a thank you for letting her wait in the warmth. The storm continued for another 2 days. I spent that time working from home, taking video calls for my software development job and periodically checking the destruction outside. My fence was going to cost a couple $1,000 to repair, but that would have to wait until spring. For now, I had bigger concerns, like making sure my pipes didn't freeze and that I didn't lose power. On day 3, the storm finally broke. I woke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off what had to be nearly 3 feet of fresh snow. The world looked pristine and beautiful, which lasted about 10 minutes before I saw the envelope tucked into my screen door. It was a formal HOA violation notice, complete with Brenda's signature and the seal of the Pinewood Heights Homeowners Association. According to the document, I was in violation of Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws regarding proper maintenance of roadways and walkways during winter weather events. I was being fined $500 and required to appear before the board to explain my negligent behavior that had resulted in property damage and endangered community members. I read it 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise. The audacity was stunning even for Brenda. She'd crashed into my fence on my private property during a blizzard, and now she was fining me for it. I called my lawyer, Robert Chen, who had handled the property purchase and the previous HOA dispute. His secretary said he was in court but would call me back that afternoon. While I waited, I did what any reasonable person would do in 2025. I checked my security cameras. I'd installed a comprehensive camera system when I moved in, partly for security and partly because I worked from home and wanted to keep an eye on package deliveries. I had cameras covering my driveway, the road, and the fence line. If Brenda thought she could spin some story about my negligence, she was in for a surprise. The footage was illuminating. Time-stamped at 10:47 a.m. on the day of the accident, you could see Brenda's Lexus entering my private road from the subdivision. The visibility was terrible, but the camera's metadata confirmed it was during the worst of the storm. She was driving too fast for conditions, at least 25 miles per hour on an unplowed, unsalted private road during a blizzard. You could see the moment she hit a patch of ice, overcorrected, and slid directly into the fence. The impact happened at 10:49 a.m. What made it even more interesting was the audio. The cameras had picked up her voice when I'd arrived. "Your road is a sheet of ice" wasn't quite the same as admitting fault, but combined with the video evidence of her speed and the conditions, it painted a clear picture. Robert called me back at 3 o'clock. I explained the situation, emailed him the video footage, and waited while he reviewed it. "This is fairly straightforward," he said finally. "She's got no case. Your property deed is clear that the private road is yours alone." The HOA bylaws explicitly state they only apply to common areas and individual lots within the subdivision boundaries. Your road isn't part of either. Even if it was, Michigan law doesn't require private property owners to salt or plow during active weather events. That HOA fine is completely invalid. So what do I do? Ignore the fine. Don't show up to their little board meeting and send them a letter stating that they have no jurisdiction. Keep the video evidence in case she escalates. And Isaac, she's probably going to escalate. He was right. A week later, I received another letter. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law, representing Brenda Patterson in a civil lawsuit against me for negligence, reckless endangerment, and failure to maintain safe conditions on my property. She was suing me for $20,000 to cover vehicle repairs, medical expenses for emotional distress and potential whiplash, and punitive damages. The lawsuit was filed in Emmett County Circuit Court, and I had 30 days to respond. I sat at my kitchen table reading the complaint, feeling that unique mix of anger and disbelief that comes from being blamed for something that absolutely wasn't your fault. The complaint was a masterpiece of creative fiction. According to Brenda's version of events, I had knowingly and negligently failed to properly maintain my road, despite repeated warnings from concerned community members about the dangerous conditions. She claimed she had been forced to traverse my road because it was the only accessible route to check on elderly residents during the storm. The only accessible route. Never mind that she could have accessed every property in Pinewood Heights from the main subdivision roads without ever touching my property. Never mind that there were no elderly residents down my road because I was the only one who lived on it. Never mind that she'd been driving recklessly during a declared weather emergency. I called Robert again. This time we scheduled an in-person meeting. His office in Petoskey overlooked Little Traverse Bay, and on a clear day like this, the frozen water stretched out like a sheet of white glass. Robert was in his 50s, with gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of ridiculous legal dispute Michigan had to offer. "She's committed," he said after reviewing the complaint. "This isn't just posturing. She's filed an actual lawsuit. Can she win?" "Not if we present the evidence properly. The video footage alone would sink her case. But here's what concerns me. She's claiming she was on HOA business, checking on residents during an emergency. That gives her a thread of an argument that she had legitimate reason to be on your road, which might give her standing to argue you had some duty of care. That's insane. It's my private property." "I agree, but we need to be prepared. Michigan premises liability law says that even on private property, if someone is there for legitimate business and you know about dangerous conditions, you might have some duty to warn them or make it safe." Now, her case is weak because she was an uninvited trespasser during a blizzard, but we need to anticipate every argument her lawyer will make. So what do? We file a response denying all allegations. We file a motion for summary judgment based on the video evidence and the fact that she was trespassing. We document every interaction with her and the HOA, and we prepare for discovery because her lawyer is going to request everything. The next few weeks were a blur of legal paperwork. Robert filed our response, denying every allegation and asserting a counterclaim for the damage to my fence. We requested copies of all HOA records regarding any discussions of my property. We sent interrogatories asking Brenda to explain exactly what HOA business required her to be on my private road during a blizzard. In the meantime, the HOA wasn't done with me either. Despite Robert sending them a cease and desist letter, they held a special board meeting to discuss my continued violations and failure to cooperate with community standards. I wasn't invited, naturally. What I got was the result: a letter informing me that my HOA dues were being increased by $300 per month as a special assessment for additional road maintenance in the community. Robert had a field day with that one. Within a week, we'd filed a complaint with the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, which oversees HOA compliance, and sent the HOA board a letter promising legal action if they didn't rescind the illegal special assessment. The board backed down on the assessment but doubled down on everything else. They sent another violation notice for my failure to appear at their meeting. They claimed my fence repair was happening too slowly and was an eyesore that violated community standards. They even tried to cite me for the tire tracks and debris from the tow truck, claiming it was unauthorized commercial activity on subdivision roads. Every letter went straight to Robert, who was building quite a file on the HOA's harassment campaign. March arrived with the slow thaw that marks spring in northern Michigan. As the snow melted, I got a better look at the fence damage. Brenda had obliterated 15 feet of split rail fencing and cracked 2 support posts that would need to be completely replaced. I got quotes from 3 contractors, and the consensus was around $3,000 for proper repairs. Discovery in the lawsuit was producing interesting results. Brenda's answers to interrogatories claimed she had been on her way to check on Mrs. Helen Morrison, an elderly resident who lives at the end of your road. Robert flagged that immediately. Does anyone named Helen Morrison live near you? No one lives on my road except me. That's the whole point of having a private road. That's what I thought. Let me check the property records. He called back an hour later, and I could hear the grin in his voice. There's no Helen Morrison anywhere in Pinewood Heights. In fact, I pulled the HOA directory, and there's no Helen Morrison in the entire zip code. She made up a fictional old lady to justify trespassing on my property. It appears so. This is going to be a problem for her case. It got worse for Brenda at her deposition in April. Robert grilled her for 4 hours, and the transcript was devastating. Under oath, she couldn't name a single other property on my road. She couldn't explain why she needed to use my road instead of the subdivision roads. She stumbled and changed her story about the mysterious Helen Morrison. Finally, when confronted with the video footage showing her speed and the conditions, she claimed the timestamp must be wrong and the video must have been edited. So you're testifying that Mr. Anderson created fake video evidence of the accident? I'm saying it doesn't look right. The storm wasn't that bad where I was, but you testified earlier that visibility was extremely poor and conditions were treacherous, which is why you lost control of the vehicle. I lost control because there was ice everywhere. He should have salted. You expect Mr. Anderson to salt a private road during an active blizzard. I expect property owners to maintain their property safely. Even when you're trespassing on that property, her lawyer objected at that point, but the damage was done. In May, Robert filed our motion for summary judgment. The brief was a thing of beauty, laying out the video evidence, the property deeds, the Michigan law on premises liability, Brenda's contradictory testimony, and the fictional Helen Morrison. We asked the court to dismiss all of Brenda's claims and award us damages for the fence, legal fees, and the time I'd spent dealing with this nonsense. The hearing was scheduled for June 15th at the Emmett County Courthouse in Petoskey. I took the day off work and wore my only suit. The courtroom was one of those old Michigan buildings with high ceilings and wood paneling that had seen a century of disputes. Brenda sat on the opposite side with her lawyer, a nervous-looking young man named Davis, who couldn't have been more than 2 years out of law school. Judge Martha Rodriguez was in her 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd reviewed all the briefs, and from her first question, I could tell she wasn't impressed with Brenda's case. "Counselor," she said to Davis, "help me understand why your client believes she had any right to be on Mr. Anderson's private road during a snowstorm." Davis stood and launched into his prepared argument about HOA duties and community safety and reasonable access. Judge Rodriguez let him go for about 3 minutes before interrupting. "That's all very interesting, but none of it explains why Mrs. Patterson was on private property that isn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. The property deed is clear. The road is Mr. Anderson's private drive." "Your Honor, we believe the road serves a community function and therefore—" "What community?" Mr. Anderson is the only resident on that road. There is no community function. Mrs. Patterson believed she was responding to a community emergency. An emergency involving a resident who doesn't exist. Davis had no good answer for that. He tried to pivot to arguing that regardless of whether Helen Morrison existed, Brenda had acted in good faith based on a reasonable belief. Judge Rodriguez was having none of it. Counselor, I've reviewed the deposition transcript. Your client's testimony about why she was on that road changed at least 3 times. She made statements suggesting she knew the road was dangerous, yet she chose to drive on it anyway at excessive speed during a blizzard. Even if Mr. Anderson had some duty to maintain the road, which I don't believe he did, your client assumed the risk by driving on it under those conditions. When Robert stood to present our side, he barely got through his opening statement before Judge Rodriguez stopped him. Mr. Chen, I've read your brief. It's excellent work. I'm inclined to grant your motion. Is there anything else you want me to know? Robert seized the opportunity. Your Honor, I would note that this lawsuit appears to be part of a broader pattern of harassment by the HOA against my client. Since the accident, Mr. Anderson has received numerous invalid violation notices, threats of illegal fines, and other retaliatory actions from Mrs. Patterson and the HOA board. That's a serious allegation. We have documentation of all of it, Your Honor. We filed a complaint with the state regarding the HOA's conduct. Judge Rodriguez turned to Davis. Counselor, does your client wish to respond? Davis whispered urgently with Brenda, whose face had gone red. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson's role as HOA president is separate from this lawsuit. Is it? Because it seems to me that this lawsuit exists because your client crashed her car on Mr. Anderson's property through her own negligence, and rather than accept responsibility, she's using her position to retaliate against him. That doesn't reflect well on her credibility. The hearing lasted another 30 minutes, but the outcome was clear from that exchange. Judge Rodriguez granted our motion for summary judgment, dismissing all of Brenda's claims. She awarded us damages for the fence repairs, though she declined to award attorney's fees, saying that while Brenda's case was weak, it didn't quite rise to the level of frivolous litigation that would justify fee shifting. However, Judge Rodriguez added, I want to be clear that this court takes a dim view of using litigation as a means of harassment. Mrs. Patterson, you damaged Mr. Anderson's property through your own negligence. You then attempted to blame him for your mistake and used your position in the HOA to make his life difficult. That behavior is unacceptable. If Mr. Anderson pursues further legal action regarding the HOA's conduct, this ruling will not help your position. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in months. Robert clapped me on the shoulder. Well done. Now let's see if she's smart enough to back off. She wasn't. 2 weeks after the court ruling, I received another HOA violation notice. This one claimed my landscaping didn't meet community standards because there were dead branches visible from the road, and my lawn had irregular mowing patterns. The attached photos clearly showed my property, but the violations were absurd. The dead branches were part of a natural wildlife habitat I deliberately maintained. The irregular mowing pattern was because I'd mowed around a family of rabbits nesting in my yard. Robert sent another cease and desist letter, this one more strongly worded. The HOA responded through their lawyer, claiming they had every right to enforce their bylaws and that all violation notices were legitimate. That's when things got interesting. I'd been in touch with several other homeowners in Pinewood Heights throughout this ordeal, and I wasn't the only one who'd had problems with Brenda's leadership. A man named Marcus Johnson had been fighting with the HOA for a year over their refusal to approve his solar panel installation, even though Michigan law protected his right to install them. A woman named Patricia Wallace had been cited for unauthorized exterior color choices when she painted her shutters a slightly different shade of blue than the one pre-approved years ago. An elderly couple, the Hendersons, had been threatened with liens on their property for being 3 days late on HOA dues. The four of us decided it was time to act. Michigan HOA law allows homeowners to call for a special election if they can get signatures from 20% of the community. Pinewood Heights had 43 homes, so we needed 9 signatures. We got 18. The special election was scheduled for August 15th. Brenda and her entire board were up for recall. In the meantime, we requested copies of all HOA financial records for the past 3 years, which state law required them to provide. What we found was stunning. The HOA's budget was a mess of questionable expenses. Brenda had been paying herself a management fee of $500 per month, despite the bylaws specifying that board positions were volunteer. She'd approved a contract with her brother-in-law's landscaping company at rates 30% higher than market value. She'd spent thousands of dollars on legal consultations that had no documentation or explanation. Most damning of all, we found records of her using HOA funds to pay part of her attorney's fees for the lawsuit against me. That was illegal under Michigan law. HOA funds could only be used for legitimate association business, not personal lawsuits. Robert helped us compile everything into a formal complaint, which we filed with the Michigan Attorney General's office in addition to the existing complaint with the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. The special election in August was packed. Every homeowner in Pinewood Heights seemed to show up, crammed into the subdivision's clubhouse. Brenda tried to maintain control, insisting that proper procedures be followed, and that the recall election was invalid because of technicalities in how signatures had been collected. A homeowner named Tom Chen, who happened to be a retired attorney, calmly pulled out his copy of Michigan's Nonprofit Corporation Act and read aloud the sections governing HOA recall elections. Every signature had been properly collected. Every notice had been properly posted. The election was entirely valid. When the votes were counted, it wasn't even close. Brenda and her entire board were removed by a margin of 36-7. New board members were elected on the spot. Marcus Johnson became president, Patricia Wallace became treasurer, and 3 other homeowners who'd been vocal about reform took the remaining positions. The new board's first action was to vote unanimously to cancel all pending violation notices and refund any improper fines collected over the past 2 years. Their second action was to hire a forensic accountant to review all HOA finances from Brenda's tenure. The accountant's report arrived in October. Brenda had misappropriated approximately $47,000 in HOA funds over 6 years. Some of it was the unauthorized management fees. Some was the inflated landscaping contract with her relative. A chunk was legitimate expenses she'd charged to her personal credit card and then reimbursed herself from HOA funds at a markup. And yes, there was the matter of using association money to pay for her lawsuit against me. The new board voted to pursue criminal charges. Robert connected them with a prosecutor he knew in the county attorney's office. By November, the investigation was in full swing. Brenda tried to fight back one last time. She claimed the recall election had been rigged, that the new board was corrupt, that the forensic accountant's report was biased. She posted rants on the Pinewood Heights Facebook page until Marcus, as the new president, removed her administrative access. She showed up at the November board meeting and had to be escorted out by the police when she refused to leave during the public comment period after her 3 minutes were up. In December, Brenda Patterson was formally charged with embezzlement and misappropriation of funds. The Emmett County Prosecutor's Office filed charges under Michigan Penal Code Section 750.174, which covers the fraudulent use of funds by corporate officers. Each count carried up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Her arraignment was scheduled for January 7th. I didn't attend. I was done with Brenda Patterson. Robert went as an observer and reported back that she'd pled not guilty and been released on a personal recognizance bond. The legal process ground forward through winter. Brenda's criminal defense lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was firm. The evidence was overwhelming, and the amount involved was substantial enough that they wouldn't settle for just probation. Meanwhile, my life was returning to normal. My fence was fully repaired, paid for by the insurance payout from the court judgment against Brenda. The new HOA board was functioning smoothly, focused on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. They'd even updated the bylaws to add oversight provisions and spending limits to prevent future abuse. In March, almost exactly a year after this whole nightmare began, Brenda accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to 1 count of embezzlement and 1 count of misappropriation of funds. The sentence was 3 years in prison, suspended to 18 months of incarceration followed by 2 years of probation. She was ordered to pay full restitution of $47,000 to the HOA, plus fines and court costs. She was also banned from serving on any HOA or nonprofit board in Michigan for 10 years. I learned all this from Marcus, who called me the evening the plea was entered. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "It's finally over." "How do you feel about it?" "Honestly, relieved." She needed to face consequences, but I'm glad the community can move on now. I agreed. The whole experience had been exhausting and infuriating, but it had also revealed something important about standing up to bullies who abuse whatever small power they have. A week later, I was working in my home office when I saw a car pulling up my private road. For a moment, my heart rate spiked, old anxiety flooding back. Then I recognized the vehicle. It was Patricia Wallace, the HOA treasurer. I met her at the door. She was holding an envelope and looked slightly embarrassed. "Hi, Isaac. Sorry to bother you. The board wanted me to deliver this personally." Inside was a check for $3,000 made out to me from the Pinewood Heights HOA. "What's this?" "Restitution for what you went through." When we were going through the finances, we found that Brenda had used HOA money for her lawsuit against you. The board voted unanimously that the association owes you for that abuse of power. It doesn't cover your attorney's fees, I know, but it's what we can do. I stared at the check. Robert had charged me about $15,000 total to handle everything, and I'd already written that off as the cost of defending myself. This was unexpected. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, we did. What happened to you was wrong, and it happened because of how our association was being run. We want to make it right." I thanked her and watched her drive away back down my private road, which had been cleared of snow and salted. By me. Because it was my road and my responsibility, which I'd never shirked despite Brenda's accusations. Spring came properly to northern Michigan, bringing with it the smell of thawing earth and pine sap. I spent an afternoon working on my fence, not because it needed repairs, but because I wanted to reinforce a section that looked weak. It was meditative work, sinking posts into the ground and securing the rails. I thought about the past year, about how a simple snowstorm accident had spiraled into lawsuits, HOA battles, and criminal charges. About how one person's refusal to take responsibility for her own actions had exposed a pattern of abuse and corruption. About how a community had come together to fix a broken system. My phone rang. It was Robert. "Hey, Isaac, got some news. Brenda's lawyer filed a civil suit against you on her behalf. Wrongful prosecution or something. It's completely frivolous, but I wanted to give you a heads up." I laughed. I actually laughed. "You're kidding." "I wish I was. Don't worry about it. I'll get it dismissed. She's grasping at straws from a jail cell." "She's really in jail now," started her sentence last week. "And between you and me, I heard from a friend in the prosecutor's office that they're also investigating her taxes. Apparently, when you embezzle money, you're supposed to report it as income. She didn't. So more charges, federal ones potentially. IRS doesn't play around." After we hung up, I went back to my fence work. The sun was warm on my back, and somewhere in the trees, birds were singing their spring songs. My private road stretched out behind my house, peaceful and quiet, exactly as it should be. I'd learned a lot over the past year. I'd learned that standing up to bullies was exhausting but necessary. I'd learned that documentation and evidence were worth their weight in gold. I'd learned that good lawyers were essential, and that communities could reform themselves when they had the will to do it. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the worst storms weren't the ones that dumped 3 feet of snow. Sometimes they came in the form of a middle-aged woman named Brenda, driving too fast on someone else's private road, refusing to take responsibility, and spending years abusing whatever power she could grab. But storms pass. Fences get repaired. Justice, slow as it might be, eventually arrives. I finished securing the last rail and stood back to admire my work. The fence was solid, straight, and strong, just like it should be. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Board meeting next week. Want to join as an observer? We're discussing the new community garden proposal." I texted back that I'd be there. The old HOA had been about control and punishment. The new one was actually trying to build community. That was worth supporting. As I walked back to my house, I glanced down my private road one more time. It was mine, maintained by me, used by me, and no longer the subject of any legal disputes or HOA complaints. That evening, I fired up my grill for the first time that season and cooked a steak while watching the sun set through the pine trees. The meat sizzled, the smoke rose into the clear air, and everything was peaceful. Robert called again the next morning. Got an update on that frivolous suit Brenda filed. Her lawyer withdrew it. Apparently even he has limits. That was fast. Between you and me, I think he realized she's not exactly a credible plaintiff when she's serving time for embezzlement. Plus, I sent him a rather detailed letter explaining how we'd seek sanctions if he pursued it. So that's really it. It's finally over. Unless she tries something else from prison, yeah. But I think she's got bigger problems now. The IRS is definitely investigating, and that's not something her charm is going to get her out of. After Robert hung up, I sat on my porch with my coffee and thought about closure. The legal system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Brenda was facing consequences for her actions. The HOA was reformed and functioning properly. My fence was repaired, my property was secure, and my private road was exactly that, private. I spent the rest of the morning working on a software project for a client in California. The work was engaging, complex enough to require focus, but not so difficult that I couldn't occasionally glance out the window at the woods surrounding my property. This was why I'd bought this place. The privacy, the peace, the ability to live without someone constantly looking over my shoulder and inventing violations. Around noon, I took a break and checked my email. There was a message from Marcus with the agenda for next week's HOA meeting. Among the items, officially removing all records of invalid violation notices from homeowner files, including mine. It was a symbolic gesture more than anything. The notices had already been invalidated, but Marcus wanted to make sure they were expunged from the records entirely. I appreciated that attention to detail. It showed the new board understood that Brenda's regime had left scars on the community, and they were trying to heal them systematically. The next few weeks were blessedly boring. I worked. I maintained my property. I attended one HOA meeting where the most controversial discussion was whether to spend $800 on new landscaping at the subdivision entrance. The motion passed 7-0. Democracy in action. In early May, I got another call from Robert. IRS made their move. Brenda's been charged with tax evasion, 3 counts. She didn't report the embezzled funds, which counts as income, and she also apparently claimed fake business deductions related to her HOA work. What's that mean for her sentence? If convicted, probably more prison time, federal this time. Tax evasion is serious business. The IRS has a conviction rate of about 90% when they actually file charges. Part of me feels bad for her. That's because you're a decent person. Don't feel too bad. She made every choice that led her here. He was right. Brenda had chosen to embezzle funds. She'd chosen to lie about why she was on my road. She'd chosen to file a frivolous lawsuit rather than accept responsibility. She'd chosen to use her HOA position to harass and retaliate. Every consequence she faced was the direct result of her own actions. Still, there was something sad about the whole trajectory. Brenda had presumably started as HOA president with at least some good intentions. Maybe she'd wanted to help the community. But somewhere along the way, she'd let the small amount of power go to her head. She'd started believing she was above the rules, that she knew better than everyone else, that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. It was a cautionary tale about unchecked authority and the importance of accountability. The HOA's new bylaws, which the board had spent months drafting, and which the community voted to adopt in June, included multiple safeguards. Board members served maximum 2-year terms with a 6-year lifetime limit. Financial decisions over $500 required a vote of the full board, and decisions over $5,000 required community approval. A yearly independent audit was mandatory. Homeowners could request financial records at any time without providing a reason. Marcus had asked me to help review the financial provisions since I'd been through the worst of the old system. I'd worked with him and Patricia to craft language that protected the community while still allowing the board to function efficiently. It felt good to turn my negative experience into something constructive. In July, I got a letter from the Michigan Attorney General's office. It was a formal notification that their investigation into the Pinewood Heights HOA under Brenda Patterson's leadership had been concluded. Their findings supported the criminal charges already filed. They were closing their case, but noted that their report was available as a public record if anyone wanted it. I requested a copy, mostly out of curiosity. When it arrived, it was a thorough document outlining every financial irregularity, every violation of nonprofit governance law, and every instance where Brenda had abused her position. Reading it was validating. Everything I'd experienced, every complaint that had seemed petty or vindictive at the time, was part of a larger pattern of misconduct. The report concluded with recommendations for HOA reform in Michigan, including stronger oversight requirements and clearer legal consequences for board members who abused their authority. I learned later that the Attorney General's office had sent copies of the report to every state legislator, hoping to spark reforms at the state level. Brenda's federal trial was scheduled for September. I wasn't planning to attend, but Robert convinced me it might be worth witnessing. "She destroyed a year of your life," he said. "You might find closure in seeing the process play out." The trial was in federal court in Grand Rapids, a 2-hour drive from Petoskey. I took a day off work and sat in the gallery with about a dozen other observers. Brenda looked diminished, wearing an orange jumpsuit and sitting between her 2 federal public defenders. She'd apparently burned through whatever money she had on her previous legal battles and qualified for court-appointed attorneys now. The evidence was overwhelming. The IRS agents who testified laid out their case with mathematical precision. Brenda had failed to report $47,000 in embezzled funds as income across 3 tax years. She'd claimed $12,000 in fraudulent business expenses. She'd filed false documents with the IRS claiming her HOA work was part of a property management business, which it wasn't. Her defense was weak, essentially arguing that she hadn't understood the tax implications of her actions. The judge wasn't buying it. "Miss Patterson, ignorance of tax law is not a defense. You're a college-educated woman who served as president of your HOA for 6 years. You understood enough to embezzle funds and attempt to hide them. You understood enough to claim fraudulent deductions. The court finds that you knew exactly what you were doing." The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all 3 counts of tax evasion. Sentencing was scheduled for November. The federal guidelines suggested 24 to 36 months to run consecutively with her existing state sentence. Brenda would be in prison for at least 3 years total, possibly more. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel triumphant. It felt necessary but sad. A woman's life had been destroyed by her own poor choices, and a community had been damaged by her abuse of power. Robert met me outside. "How do you feel?" Like I can finally close this chapter. "What about the wrongful prosecution suit she filed?" "Officially dismissed last week. Her lawyer withdrew it completely and apologized to the court for filing it. I think seeing his client convicted of federal crimes made him realize how bad her judgment really was." We grabbed lunch at a diner in Grand Rapids before I drove home. The conversation wandered through various topics, but eventually came back to the case. "You know what's wild?" I said. "All of this started because she was driving too fast in a snowstorm and hit my fence. If she'd just apologized, paid for the damage, and moved on, none of this would have happened." "Pride is a hell of a drug," Robert said. "She couldn't admit she'd made a mistake, so she doubled down. Then she kept doubling down until she'd embezzled funds, filed a frivolous lawsuit, committed tax evasion, and destroyed her own life. Think she's learned anything? Probably not. People like that rarely do. They always think they're the victim, that everyone else is out to get them, that nothing is their fault." The drive home was peaceful. The Michigan autumn was starting to show itself in touches of gold and orange among the green trees. By the time I reached Petoskey and turned onto my private road, the sun was setting. My property looked beautiful in the fading light. The fence was intact. The road was well maintained. Everything was exactly as it should be. I made dinner, worked on a software project, and went to bed early. Life had returned to normal, and normal was good. November brought Brenda's sentencing hearing. I didn't attend this one. Robert sent me a text with the outcome. 30 months in federal prison, consecutive to her state sentence, plus restitution to the IRS for back taxes, penalties, and interest totaling about $90,000. With her existing 18-month state sentence, she was looking at 4 years total. The HOA board sent out a newsletter that month, updating the community on everything that had happened. It was important, Marcus told me, for everyone to understand the full scope of what had occurred under the previous administration and what safeguards were now in place. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. Several homeowners wrote thank you notes to the new board. One elderly couple sent a fruit basket to my house, which was unexpected but touching. They'd been among those Brenda had threatened with liens over late dues, and they wanted to thank me for standing up to her. December arrived with fresh snow, though nothing like the blizzard that had started this whole mess. I watched it fall from my office window, content. My cameras were still running, still recording, but now they were just a security system rather than crucial evidence in a legal battle. The HOA held its annual holiday party at the clubhouse. I almost didn't go, but Marcus convinced me. "You're part of this community," he said. "People want to see you." He was right. I spent the evening talking with neighbors I'd barely known before. Patricia told me about her solar panel installation, finally approved and generating power. Tom Chen, the retired lawyer, shared stories about past HOA disputes he'd handled in other states. The Hendersons thanked me repeatedly for helping expose Brenda's misconduct. It felt good to be part of a functional community, rather than fighting with a dysfunctional authority figure. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. A simple accident during a snowstorm had exposed corruption, triggered legal battles, resulted in criminal convictions, and ultimately reformed an entire community organization. It was proof that systems could change, that accountability mattered, and that standing up to abuse was worth the effort. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my back porch watching fireworks from town light up the sky over the frozen bay. My private road stretched out behind me, peaceful under a light coating of fresh snow. I hadn't salted it. I didn't need to. It was my road, on my property, and the only person who used it was me. Somewhere, Brenda Patterson was spending New Year's Eve in a federal prison, facing years more of incarceration and nearly $140,000 in restitution payments. Her life had been derailed by her own choices, her own refusal to take responsibility, her own abuse of power. I felt no satisfaction in her suffering, but I felt deep satisfaction in the outcome. Justice had been served. A corrupt system had been reformed. A community had learned the importance of oversight and accountability, and I had my fence back, stronger than before. As midnight approached and the fireworks intensified, I raised my glass of bourbon to the night sky. Here's to private roads, to security cameras, to good lawyers, to communities that care, and to the simple principle that everyone, no matter how small their kingdom, must answer for their actions. The new year was going to be better. I could feel it. Behind me, through my kitchen window, I could see my computer screen displaying my security camera feeds. 4 views of my property, all peaceful and quiet. No cars crashing through fences. No angry HOA presidents demanding I explain myself. Just snow, trees, and the life I'd chosen. It was perfect. The next morning, I woke to an email from Marcus. The HOA had received the final restitution check from Brenda's assets, which had been seized and liquidated to cover her debts. After all the legal dust had settled, each homeowner would receive a small refund, about $150 from the recovered funds. It wasn't much, but it was symbolic. Money that Brenda had taken was being returned to the community she'd harmed. I used my refund to buy new bird feeders for my property. Within a week, I had chickadees, nuthatches, and woodpeckers visiting regularly. Watching them from my office window while I worked became a daily pleasure. Life moved forward. Spring came again, my second spring in this house, and with it came growth and renewal. The fence stood strong. The road was maintained exactly as I chose to maintain it. The HOA functioned properly, focused on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement and personal vendettas. Robert called occasionally to update me on minor legal matters. Brenda had apparently tried to appeal her convictions, but both appeals were denied. She was going to serve her full sentence. After release, she'd face years of probation and a massive debt burden from the restitution orders. "Think she'll ever pay it all off?" I asked during one call. "Probably not. But that's between her and the government now. Your part in this is done." He was right. My part was done. I'd stood up for myself, defended my rights, exposed corruption, and helped reform a broken system. That was more than most people ever did. Years from now, when people asked about the Pinewood Heights HOA, they'd probably still mention Brenda Patterson, but as a cautionary tale rather than a hero. The story would be about how a community came together to fix a problem, not about one woman's reign of petty tyranny. And somewhere in that story would be a footnote about a snowstorm, a crashed fence, a frivolous lawsuit, and one homeowner's refusal to be bullied. That footnote was my victory, small but complete. I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set through the pine trees, and thought about how random events could cascade into life-changing consequences. If Brenda hadn't driven down my road that day, if she'd apologized instead of blamed, if she'd accepted responsibility instead of doubling down, but she did drive down my road. She did crash through my fence. She did try to blame me. And in doing so, she set in motion a chain of events that exposed her corruption and led to her imprisonment. Sometimes justice worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but it worked. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Wallace. "Board meeting next week. We're voting on the proposal for new streetlights at the entrance. Hope you can make it." I texted back that I'd be there. This was what HOAs were supposed to be. Neighbors working together to maintain common spaces and make reasonable decisions about shared resources. Not petty tyrants inventing violations and filing frivolous lawsuits. The Pinewood Heights HOA had been broken, and now it was fixed. That was worth celebrating. As darkness fell and the stars came out, I went inside and locked the door behind me. My home was secure. My property was maintained. My rights were protected. And my private road, the one that had started this whole mess, stretched out into the woods exactly as it should. Private, peaceful, and mine. That was all I'd ever wanted, and finally, that was exactly what I had.